You know that moment when someone quietly steps back from the world for a while? Not dramatically, not with a big announcement, just a slow fading out. Messages become shorter, calls go unanswered, plans that once felt easy start to feel heavier somehow. And then eventually, the silence settles in. Most people notice it only after it has already happened. And when they do notice it, they usually interpret it in the simplest way possible. They assume distance means indifference, that silence means rejection, that disappearing means someone simply didn't care enough to explain. But there's a certain kind of person who moves through the world a little differently. Someone who leaves quietly not because they want to hurt anyone, but because explaining themselves feels harder than leaving. Society tends to label these people in very blunt ways: aloof, avoidant, emotionally unavailable, sometimes even cold. But those labels miss something important, because in many cases, the disappearing itself isn't really the story. It's the result of something deeper happening internally. The psychology of people who disappear without explaining is often misunderstood. Most conversations about it stop at the surface, describing the behavior without asking what emotional or neurological patterns might be driving it.
And when you look closer, there's usually more going on than people realize. Human connection is regulated by the nervous system far more than most people think. Psychologists studying interpersonal stress often talk about something called emotional overload, a point where the brain perceives interaction not as connection, but as pressure. When that happens, the nervous system begins searching for ways to reduce stimulation. For some people, that response looks like talking things through. For others, it looks like distance. Disappearing, in many cases, isn't an act of indifference. It's a form of regulation, a quiet attempt to calm a system that has become overwhelmed. Neuroscience research into stress responses shows that when emotional pressure rises past a certain threshold, the brain can shift into what's sometimes called a withdrawal response. Not fight, not flight, but step back. Silence becomes the safest place to reorganize thoughts, emotions, and energy. The challenge is that this internal experience is almost invisible from the outside. To someone waiting for an explanation, the silence feels confusing, even personal. But inside the mind of someone withdrawing, the silence often feels necessary, not to punish anyone, just to breathe again. And if you trace this pattern far enough back, it often connects to earlier experiences with emotional environments.
Many people who disappear without explaining learned something subtle growing up, that explaining themselves didn't always help. Maybe conversations turned into arguments. Maybe emotions were dismissed. Maybe vulnerability was met with misunderstanding, criticism, or pressure to justify feelings that were already difficult to express. Over time, the nervous system begins to learn a quiet equation. Explaining equals conflict. Distance equals peace. So when tension appears in adult relationships, the brain doesn't necessarily reach for discussion first. It reaches for the strategy that historically reduced stress: space. From the outside, that can look like avoidance. From the inside, it often feels like self-protection. And it's important to say something here that rarely gets acknowledged. This pattern isn't inherently better or worse than the opposite one. Some people regulate closeness by talking things out immediately. Others regulate by stepping away until their internal world settles. Neither approach is universally right. They're simply different nervous systems trying to maintain stability. The difficulty is that when two different patterns meet, misunderstanding can easily grow in the space between them. One person searches for clarity through conversation. The other searches for clarity through distance. And without realizing it, both can end up feeling unseen. But there's another layer to this behavior that people often overlook. People who disappear quietly are usually not unaware of the impact it has. In fact, many of them think about it more than anyone realizes. They replay conversations in their heads. They consider reaching out again. They wonder whether explaining would make things better or just create more confusion. The silence is rarely as simple as it looks. Sometimes it's the result of someone trying to organize emotions they don't yet fully understand themselves. Sometimes it's someone trying to avoid saying something they might regret while overwhelmed. And sometimes it's someone who has learned over many years that stepping away feels safer than risking another misunderstood explanation. There's also a quiet paradox inside this pattern. People who disappear without explaining are often more sensitive to emotional tension than others, not less. They tend to notice subtle shifts in tone, changes in energy, small signals that something in the relationship feels different. And because they feel those shifts so strongly, their instinct can be to create space before the tension grows larger. The withdrawal isn't always about disconnecting. Sometimes it's about preventing something fragile from breaking further. But like most psychological adaptations, this strategy carries both strengths and costs. Distance can protect the nervous system. It can create the calm needed for reflection, perspective, and emotional recovery. But it can also create unanswered questions for the people left on the other side of the silence. And that tension between self-protection and connection is something many people quietly carry, not because they want to hurt anyone, but because their internal wiring learned that retreating is sometimes the most stable place to stand. None of this means disappearing is perfect, or painless, or that it always leads to the best outcomes. Human relationships are complicated precisely because every person brings a different emotional map into the interaction. But understanding the psychology behind a behavior changes the way we see it. What once looked like indifference might actually be overwhelm. What once looked like coldness might actually be sensitivity trying to protect itself. And what once looked like rejection might simply be someone trying to reorganize their inner world in the only way they learned how. If you've ever found yourself quietly stepping back from people or situations without explaining everything you're feeling, it doesn't automatically mean something is wrong with you. It often means your mind developed a particular way of restoring balance when emotions become too tangled to sort out in real time. Different people regulate closeness differently. Some move toward conversation, some move toward quiet. Both are attempts to navigate the same basic human need, to feel safe inside connection. And sometimes the behaviors we judge the most harshly are simply the ones we understand the least. Because when you look closely enough, many of the patterns people carry today began long before they had the words to explain them. And if this experience feels familiar in some way, there are other patterns like it that shape how people move toward and away from connection. Patterns that most people notice in their lives, but rarely have explained out loud.